Paul Thomas Anderson is a man who really enjoys eating pizza. But in his free time, he also happens to be a director who has made some of the most critically acclaimed films of the last 30 years. He was such an inspiration to me personally that I ended up writing my entire third-year dissertation at university on him. I strongly believe Anderson to be one of the greatest filmmakers of all time. I mean, the guy has multiple masterpieces to his name, and has even been named by certain people as the heir to Stanley Kubrick, which are pretty big boots to fill, but I'd say the comparison is more than deserved. Much like Kubrick, Anderson's films are methodical and dark. They present deeply flawed characters and dysfunctional families, always leaving it to the audience to decide what was really going on, what it was really all about. Despite all the critical acclaim he gets within film circles, I feel like he does not get anywhere near enough attention from mainstream audiences. Most of his films have failed to break even at the box office, and overall he's hardly the same household name as a Spielberg or a Scorsese, despite, in my opinion, being a more consistently great director. In an effort to spread the PTA message, and also just because I thought it would be fun, I have decided to rank all of his films from worst to best. Due to the very subjective lens which clouds his entire filmography, PTA's films tend to be extremely personal experiences and will often elicit very different reactions from each person, so this is my warning. This list is my opinion. I will be going off my instincts and personal judgment alone. Just a quick note, this list does not include his short films, documentaries or music videos, although I highly recommend checking them out as well. But anyway, let us begin. Paul Thomas Anderson, worst to best, starting with... I can't imagine anyone is going to get too angry with this take. Hard Eight is Anderson's first and worst film. Although when I say worst, I'm using pretty big quotation marks, because to be honest, this is a pretty solid debut. It just happens to be eclipsed by the 8 far more interesting and complex films Anderson would go on to make immediately after this. I think what's clear while watching Hard Eight is that here we have a very talented 24-year-old who has wanted to make films all of his life. He's studied every movie under the sun and is now getting his dream chance to direct a feature film. And while the film is unpolished, while the script is pretty simple and cliché, and although Anderson is still finding his own voice, his own visual style, we do begin to see here some of the trademarks he will go on to perfect later down the line. I'm talking about the themes of surrogate families, chance, and father-son relationships, beautiful long tracking shots and brilliant needle drops. We see actors who go on to appear in many of Anderson's films, John C. Reilly, Philip Baker Hall, and of course Philip Seymour Hoffman, who I will continue to gush over throughout this video because I think he's probably the greatest actor who's ever lived. He has like 3 minutes of screen time in this, and it's literally the 3 best minutes in the entire film. So while Hard Eight is not the most exciting or engaging piece of work, I think it can stand on its own 2 feet as a pretty mellow mood piece and a glimpse into the genius filmmaker Anderson would very soon become. Wow, has this film not aged well. I've always struggled with Magnolia, and if I'm being completely honest, I had this film dead last up until this most recent rewatch. However, the reason I've put it above Hard Eight is that you cannot fault Paul Thomas Anderson's ambition with this one. When I say Magnolia hasn't aged well or that it's dated, I don't mean it in some cancel culture way. I actually think certain segments, mainly the Tom Cruise bit, is even more relevant now than it was in 1999. But I feel like we as a collective society have since realised that these sprawling narratives with 50 different characters all crossing over with each other, they just don't really work in film format, even when the film clocks in at just over 3 hours. Not that you can really feel the 3-hour runtime, Anderson has always been great at pacing his films, but still. A big problem you get with anthologies or any film with lots of different storylines is that there will always be threads which you prefer to others. Therefore, you're spending at least half the runtime just waiting to get back to the stuff you actually like. In Magnolia's case, Tom Cruise is just so good that it really overshadows the rest of the film for me. I think this is his best performance, and honestly one of the best supporting roles of the 90s. While Cruise does steal the film, I also have to give a shout out to, once again, Philip Seymour Hoffman. I really love the story of how Anderson wrote Hoffman's character just as a, quote, really simple, uncomplicated, caring character. In contrast to the plethora of outcasts, eccentrics, and nutjobs Hoffman was known for playing throughout his career. John C. Reilly also gives it his all, and I guess the romantic subplot with him and Melora Walters is okay, but honestly, that's about it. The entire game show narrative and all the characters which surround it I just find pretty dull and cliché, which is a shame because it probably takes up the most screen time out of all the subplots. William H. Macy's talents are wasted on this very odd side quest to attain braces, because he's in love with another guy who has braces, and ugh. Look, I love Julianne Moore, I think she's a terrific actress, but I firmly believe that she could be cut from this film completely, and nothing would change. In fact, it would make the film better. Her character is just annoying and has absolutely no characterization other than sad. And I think that really strikes the heart of why Magnolia does not work for me. It is far too melodramatic. It really wants you to take it seriously, and it does not try to hide this. But I don't think this is what Anderson is good at. In fact, I think the reason Anderson is such a great filmmaker is his ability to strike a tonal and emotional complexity. Even his most serious films, The Master and There Will Be Blood, are darkly comical in a sick kind of way. This is why his films are such personal and subjective experiences. While his filmography may be incredibly diverse, ranging from twisted character studies to Linklater-esque chill-out movies, all of his films share one trait: they are all self-aware. None of them insist upon themselves. None of them take themselves 100% seriously. Except for Magnolia. It almost feels soapy in this regard, like, stop crying all the time. Stop crying, do something! Maybe I'm being harsh, Magnolia does have some very high highs, but unfortunately its lows are very low, and that's why it's only number 8. I wish I could put this film higher. I really do, man. Inherent Vice is a weird one for me, because by all logic, this should be my favourite film of all time. If you had told me that Paul Thomas Anderson was directing a hazy art house Big Lebowski, starring Joaquin Phoenix, based on a book by Thomas Pynchon about hippies and the fading dream of the 1960s, I would have told you, no way. That is literally my dream movie. However, in reality, Inherent Vice is nonsense. And of course, this is the point. The plot is impossibly complex. You are not supposed to understand what is going on. You're just supposed to seep yourself in the haze, flowing from confusing plot to funky-looking side character, and I completely accept that. But I don't think Anderson does enough with the style to justify its lack of substance, and this has always been my biggest takeaway from Inherent Vice. I watch this film every year, hoping to finally connect with it, because as I've said, it ticks all the boxes for being my favourite film of all time. But I'm always left just a little disappointed. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are definitely things which deserve praise here. I think this is the best performance of Josh Brolin's career, which is a pretty big claim if you think about all the great roles he's had over the years. Robert Elswit's cinematography is, as always, excellent, and arguably carries the movie. I mean, if this film didn't look as good as it does, it could have very easily been dead last in this list. And of course, this is part of Joaquin Phoenix's incredible early 2010s run. And here, with his line delivery and physical comedy, is channeling something akin to Buster Keaton 2 hours after ingesting a mean pot brownie. But at the end of the day, the best way to put it is that I just don't think Inherent Vice is as groovy as its biggest admirers claim it is. It's a self-proclaimed stoner film, but the only effects it shares with marijuana is the confusion and short-term memory loss. It doesn't have the character-driven comedy of The Big Lebowski, it's not the style-over-substance neo-noir detective masterpiece which something like the original Blade Runner is, and I don't think its portrayal of the death of the 60s and the druggy melancholia which came after it is anywhere near as effective as a Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. However, there is definitely something with Inherent Vice, hidden behind the layers of smoke and metaphor and controlled chaos, which keeps me coming back, hoping for it to finally click with me. Perhaps after a few more rewatches, I can put this a lot higher. Those Hoffman acting genes, man, they are something else. The first time I saw Licorice Pizza, I really needed to go to the toilet the entire time, and let's just say it clouded the viewing experience. However, I just rewatched it a few days ago, and if there's one thing to say about Licorice Pizza that I think everyone can agree on, is that this film is chilled out. This is a hangout movie, akin to Dazed and Confused or something of that ilk. Patrick Willems really sums it up with his Letterboxd review, where he says, "After this and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, every director I like is now required to make a fun hangout movie set in a lovingly recreated version of the time and place they grew up." And yeah, honestly, he's not wrong. This film is nostalgic and breezy and nothing really happens, but it's probably the film Anderson needed just to mellow out his filmography a bit. The closest thing he had previously to a relaxing film was Inherent Vice, and even that has the most intentionally complicated plot ever. Licorice Pizza is the type of film which feels like Anderson just kept on writing and filming scenes on the fly until he hit that 2-hour mark and realised, oh, I should probably wrap this up. Now, does this work? Kinda, I guess? The thing is, Anderson at this point is such a confident writer and director that he can sort of just get away with it. And this loose feel is complemented really well by Alana Haim and Cooper Hoffman's very naturalistic performances. I think these two actors are the best things about the film, along with the wistful soundtrack and once again excellent cinematography. While some people may complain about the central romance of the film, whether talking about the chemistry or age gap between the two main characters, I think Licorice Pizza is meant to be an awkward fable. I think it knows exactly what it's doing. I mean, even the film's title is intentionally oxymoronic. The whole thing doesn't really make sense. But then again, neither does Growing Up. I think the biggest criticism I can level at Licorice Pizza is that it's pure directionless, just like Inherent Vice, can sometimes leave me just a tiny bit bored and waiting for the film to pick up pace again. Unlike most of the other films Anderson has made, Licorice Pizza is not a film which really sticks with you after the credits roll, but while watching it, I think we can all admit, it's a pretty fun time. I'll be honest, the difference in quality between Anderson's bottom 4 films and his top 5 films is pretty big. In fact, if this was a tier list, it would look something like this. We have now hit that special point in this ranking, where every movie is a masterpiece. The difference in quality between these 5 films we're just about to talk about is not that great, and this is really where my personal preference is going to come into play. So, let's discuss Phantom Thread.
And the shoe polish on the front of the dress.
Shoe polish from what?
From his shoe.
Phantom Thread is the greatest romantic comedy of all time, and this is a hill I will die on. This film is hilarious. It is genuinely one of the funniest movies I have ever seen. And if you have only seen Phantom Thread once and are disagreeing with me here, I implore you to give it a rewatch. The thing just oozes with comedy. The subtle glances, the awkward pauses, the line delivery, oh my god.
Mrs. Vaughn is satisfied with the dress.
No one gives a tinker's fucking curse about Mrs. Vaughn's satisfaction.
However, Phantom Thread is simultaneously a very delicate and patient meditation on romance, how it can drive people insane, how it can make people sick, both figuratively and literally, and why we still choose to accept it into our lives. Daniel Day-Lewis, of course, gives a perfect performance as Reynolds, a very high-strung dressmaker and professional man-child, but Vicky Krieps, who was relatively unknown at the time, does a brilliant job of keeping up with him, and together they have some of the best chemistry between any two actors in Anderson's filmography. Their scenes together are so violent and chaotic, sexual tension just brims in every interaction, but my god, they're also just so toxic together. The scene where Alma makes Reynolds dinner and he's annoyed because the asparagus isn't prepared properly, oh my god, easily top 5 Anderson scenes for me. Maybe the best and most realistic argument ever put on film. Also, I can't believe I've gone this far in the video without talking about perhaps Anderson's greatest collaborator, Jonny Greenwood. This guy is a genius and one of the greatest film composers of all time. He should really be in a band. I think they would make some great music. House of Woodcock sounds like something, I don't know, Beethoven would have written, but the music throughout the movie is gorgeous, complementing the very buttoned-up world Anderson presents, while also offering a contrast to the deeply sexy, depraved, and hilarious subtext which runs throughout the film. It kinda reminds me of Kubrick's Barry Lyndon in this sense. Overall, Phantom Thread is one of those really special films for me. I really love the portrayal of love as a disease. It's Why Love in the Time of Cholera is my favourite novel, and here it is done expertly, culminating in a pure genius climax, which still somehow only ranks number 2 in Anderson's best film endings for me. Nevertheless, Phantom Thread, greatest romantic comedy of all time, and still somehow only number 5 in this ranking. If that doesn't prove how highly I rate these next 4 films, I don't know what does. But anyway, speaking of comedies. Yep, There Will Be Blood, Paul Thomas Anderson's legendary, epic, gargantuan masterpiece, was the director's fifth feature film, and the one which really brought him into the mainstream. This was the first of Anderson's films to garner a ton of award buzz, all of which was completely deserved. This is genuinely one of the most jaw-dropping things ever made. There Will Be Blood was also, at the time of release, the longest break PTA had ever taken between films, and I think this is clear in the directorial choices made here. This in no way feels like it was made by the same person behind Magnolia, for example. In fact, Anderson essentially shrugs off most of his trademarks here. There is no John C. Reilly or Louise Guzman popping into frame, as funny as that would have been. Shots seem to last 3 times as long as his previous films. In fact, the whole thing just feels a lot more controlled and considered. I think this is really where you start to see the Kubrick comparisons, although what There Will Be Blood seems to be winking more in the direction of is a John Ford Western, where the virtuous cowboy is traded for a power-hungry oil man, and the triumphant Monument Valley is instead eager dry land just waiting to be drilled into for all its wealth. There are so many things to praise when it comes to There Will Be Blood, so many people at the top of their game, at the peak of their powers, but let's start with the most obvious, Daniel Day-Lewis, who here gives a performance widely acknowledged as one of the greatest in the history of cinema. And for good reason. Daniel Plainview is utterly terrifying. He's mostly stoic but can explode like the oil derricks he builds when he wants to. The guy's like the product of some botched experiment between Waluigi and the devil. I particularly love the shot of him staring at the flaming oil derrick, the fire in his eyes connoting just how deep his lust for power and capital goes. This is the best cinematography of Robert Elswit's career. I mean, just look at these shots I'm showing you. And while many people like to view There Will Be Blood as a character study, I really prefer to see it as a story about America in a stretch of time which was very important overall for the country. We have 2 incredible motivators here, being capitalism and religion, battling it out in truly tremendous and glorious fashion, and throughout all of this we are privy to, in my opinion, one of the greatest scores in film history. This was Johnny Greenwood's first ever soundtrack, released the same year as Radiohead's In Rainbows, so 2007, pretty incredible year creatively for the guy. I think Prospectors Arrive would have to be my single favourite track Greenwood has composed thus far for any film. It complements the scene where the prospectors arrive so incredibly well. It is dark, it is foreboding. It suggests that it is already too late to stop these aliens from putting fire into our great Mother Earth and plundering what's inside her for every single penny they can muster. It is a chilling scene and a truly incredible film, one which I could talk about all day, but we must move on. If you think this is Anderson's finest piece of work, or even one of the greatest films ever made, I completely understand, and honestly on a different day this could have been higher. But we have to be cutthroat when ranking such great pieces of work, and on the day I am recording this, I just feel a stronger personal connection to these final 3. Okay, I know I said Phantom Thread is the greatest romantic comedy of all time, but that's because this is more in the surreal, awkward, comical, romantic fable genre. Punch Drunk Love, Anderson's 4th film, is in my opinion his 3rd best, but this wasn't always the case. When I first saw this movie all those years ago, let's just say I did not understand the hype. I found the art house filmmaking awkward and disengaging, Adam Sandler and Emily Watson kind of annoying, and their chemistry, honestly, disingenuous. However, I don't know if I was just too young at the time to appreciate all its subtleties, but Punch Drunk Love has since fired up to become one of my all-time comfort films. This is one of those special movies, which just gets better every time I watch it. I think it's incredibly inspiring how much Anderson is able to do here with such few resources. This is PTA's shortest feature, and along with Hard 8, his most simple. This film is bare bones, man. It is stripped back of all its fat, and what we are left with is essentially a skeleton. A beautiful, beautiful skeleton. Even more so than There Will Be Blood, Punch Drunk Love feels completely isolated from the rest of Anderson's filmography. PTA has never felt so arty, so sensitive or romantic than in this film. While Phantom Thread often indulges in presenting the toxicity of romance, Punch Drunk Love feels like a celebration of relationships and how they make us stronger. Yet it's presented in this really absurd way. The first act of this film is claustrophobic as hell, and this is clear from the opening shot, where we are introduced to our protagonist, Barry Egan, played by, of course, the Sandman. Anderson often likes placing his protagonists in environments which echo their inner selves. For example, we first meet Daniel Plainview in a mineshaft, which is both his dwelling and his place of work, for he cannot separate the two. Here, Barry Egan is seen hiding in the corner of a mostly empty room, his blue shirt blending into the blue wall. He does not want to be seen or noticed by anyone. Later we see him in his office, which is essentially a glass box, fragile and exposed, just like him. This first act really stirs up the anger brewing in Barry's mind, whether it's his demasculating family, his stressful job, or his overall social isolation. This is emphasised by Jon Brion's incredibly erratic and oppressive score, which kinda sounds like, I don't know if this will make sense, but it's sort of like the introverted version of the Shining soundtrack. And this is all executed around an excellent central performance from Adam Sandler. Anderson wrote Barry Egan specifically for Sandler, and my god does he knock it out the park here. While it is no longer a secret of how good an actor the Sandman is, this was a pretty brave casting choice in 2002, as back then he was seen purely as the goofy movie star of lowest common denominator comedies. Honestly, without this film, I don't think we get an Uncut Gems. What happens after this very stressful, claustrophobic first act is just pure joy, as we see Barry's world change when he meets Lena, played by Emily Watson, a kind and compassionate woman who sees past his quirks and accepts him for who he is. Their relationship serves as a catalyst for Barry's personal growth as he starts to come to terms with his past traumas and learns to stand up for himself. He even finds a place to direct all his pent-up rage and aggression in the form of Philip Seymour Hoffman and his weird ragtag group of dodgy scammers. No, not them, that's the one. We are gifted two incredibly satisfying back-to-back scenes near the end of the movie where we see just how strong Barry now is. The first where he beats up the thugs who smashed his car, and the second where he argues with Hoffman on the phone, which produces some of the best acting and funniest line delivery in any of Anderson's films.
Listen to me. What's your name, sir? Answer me!
What's your name, asshole?
I'm Barry Egan!
In fact, the entire ending of this movie is just glorious. Overall, Punch Drunk Love is like a warm blanket on a rainy day. It may take a few watches to really understand and appreciate it, but once you get it, it is magnificent.
My heat will move your soul.
When I come to think of it, I think that tier list I showed you earlier needs to be changed just a bit. Because the truth is, I think the next couple films I'll be discussing deserve their own tier. Realistically, these two movies are all-time greats. So let's talk about a little film called Boogie Nights, which is one of the most wholesome pieces of art ever created. For me, this is Anderson's most likeable film, his most rewatchable film, his most quotable film, and some of the most fun I've had watching movies in my entire life. In fact, I like Boogie Nights so much, I even showed it to my parents. Think about the subject matter of this film. That's how dedicated I am to spreading this message. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Didn't this guy not like Magnolia? Didn't he say sprawling, intertwining stories with 50 different characters is bad? Well, first of all, I think the only way one can feasibly make a movie like this work is if all the characters are actually really interesting and unique human beings, which Boogie Nights executes perfectly. These are some of my favourite film characters ever. But second of all, this isn't really an intertwining huge story like Magnolia is. I mean, sure, it has a big cast, but realistically, Boogie Nights focuses on our main protagonist, Dirk Diggler, and then surrounds him with a host of colourful characters to not only bounce off him, but also to participate in their own little side quests. The two films have very different vibes. I just wanted to address that in case it seemed like I was contradicting myself. As I said earlier, PTA's debut Hard Eight laid the groundwork for some of Anderson's trademarks, and hinted at his directorial talents. But it is here with Boogie Nights where he establishes himself as the masterful filmmaker we all know now. In fact, it's actually kind of crazy how much Anderson improved in just a single year, with just how much more confident and ambitious he is. Boogie Nights is definitely the crowning achievement of PTA's early period, and this is clear from the opening shot, a very famous long take which not only introduces us to all the supporting characters, but also establishes the film's main relationship between Mark Wahlberg's Dirk Diggler and Burt Reynolds' Jack Horner. And honestly, this film is filled to the brim with these very efficient scenes, which are able to convey so much information and emotion. This is a 2.5-hour movie, but honestly could be a novel with the amount of ground it covers. Boogie Nights is also an incredibly well-balanced film. It wears its Altman and Scorsese influences on its sleeve, but it still always feels like a PTA movie. Here, Anderson strikes a perfect tone between the chilled-out ambience of Inherent Vice and Licorice Pizza, and the far more serious, dramatic, and complex strokes of The Master and Phantom Thread. I think a community of adult filmmakers and actors around the late 70s and early 80s is a perfect environment to achieve this tonal middle ground, as we are privy to both the hedonistic pleasure of the pornography business, but also the gritty and often dark reality of it all. I mean, that scene in the limousine is genuinely one of the most haunting moments in film history for me. But it also just has so much heart, so many great, wholesome characters to love. My favourite probably being John C. Reilly's Reed Rothschild, who is the hilarious yes man we all need in our lives. But special shoutouts must also go to Don Cheadle's Buck Swope. His side quest to find an outfit which suits him and to open up a stereo store is genius. And I think it's a massive shame he hasn't appeared in any of Anderson's other films. We also have here Philip Seymour Hoffman as Scotty, who is unsurprisingly great, and of course Alfred Molina as Rahad Jackson, who only appears in one scene, but arguably steals the entire movie. The scene in question is just so damn tense, with the roaring music and sporadic firecrackers, oh my god. Keep in mind, Anderson made this when he was just 26 years old. It is such a mature piece of work. This is honestly on the same level as Orson Welles making Citizen Kane at 25. Overall, Boogie Nights really is a personal one for me. It's probably my favourite film to come out the 90s. It's so warm, it's surprisingly tender for a film about pornography, and it also happens to contain, for my money, one of the greatest film endings of all time, which is just so ballsy and hilarious. Honestly, I could watch Boogie Nights every day. But you know what's better than sex? Scientology. Anderson struck gold when he released There Will Be Blood in 2007. It was a huge critical success, and clearly the next 5 years for the madman was just an experiment in how can I make a film even more dense, intense, brutal, interrogating, and psychologically grilling than the last one. Now, this was undoubtedly a tall order, but with The Master, Paul Thomas Anderson proved that he is not a man to bet against. This film, at least for me, is one of the most intriguing movies ever made. When it comes to pieces of art which cut through all the noise and fat to penetrate your very soul, The Master is all I could ever ask for. It's really in that same echelon as Coppola's Apocalypse Now and Satoshi Kon's Perfect Blue, in the way which you just feel naked when you watch it. You just feel completely naked. To be honest, The Master has always been a film I've struggled to talk about in any critical, analytical, or academic way. It kind of just needs to be seen to be believed. I guess the best metaphor I can use is that it's kind of like a huge jigsaw puzzle, and every time you watch it, you feel like you're one piece closer to completing your understanding of it, only to end up finding like 10 more pieces which you didn't even realise were there until now. Does that make sense? I don't know, this film leaves me dizzy and hypnotised, and like I've just been in some intense therapy session for 2 hours, but in the best way possible. Oh dear. I guess we can dissect the more technical aspects of The Master, which are, unsurprisingly, across the board, unbelievable. I mean, unbelievable. Shot for shot, this is Anderson's best-looking movie. I don't even think that's up for debate, personally. This has some of the most eye-watering cinematography ever put onto film. And it's actually funny because this is the first film in Anderson's filmography not shot by Robert Elswit. Instead, we have Romanian-born Mihai Malaime Jr., who shoots this on 70mm. A very rare thing these days, usually only utilised to capture the expanse of wide outdoor settings, think Lawrence of Arabia. However, here, when paired with the use of short lenses, even examining close-ups are re-established as gaping panoramas, signifying entire worlds within the character's eyes. It really helps turn The Master into the psychological Rorschach test of a movie it ends up being. There are certain shots here which are just etched deep into my mind. Everything from the framing to the blocking to the lighting is really just as good as it gets. But surely the most impressive weapon in the Master's arsenal are the two central performances from Joaquin Phoenix and Philip Seymour Hoffman. And honestly, this is kind of the elephant in the room whenever discourse around this film takes place, but it cannot be understated just how good these two are. I don't think you will find better acting in anything throughout history. I mean, we can talk about plays and, you sort of have to be there in person for that, but this is just a peak of recorded dramatic performance right here. I mean, the processing scene alone cements this. It's one of the best scenes ever filmed, of course. But there's so many incredible examples throughout The Master, and I could be here all day talking about them. The awkward, deprived inelegance of Phoenix's performance opposite the snug, Orson Welles vibe of Hoffman just creates such a captivating back and forth. It's difficult to believe this was their only film together, really. Yet furthermore, Philip Seymour Hoffman also helped Anderson with the script, and it was him who suggested to Anderson that Phoenix's Freddie Quell be the main protagonist of the film, instead of Lancaster Dodd, which I think was an incredibly astute directorial choice from him, as I think it changes The Master from being a movie essentially about cults and Scientology, to a film with far vaster themes of purpose and belonging, and America, and the pursuit of happiness, and... If you can't tell, this is one of my favourite films of all time, and I could talk about it all day. Once again, Jonny Greenwood, amazing score. You're noticing a pattern with these movies. As I said previously, it's just something which really needs to be seen to be believed. If you've never seen The Master, watch it. And if you have seen it, watch it again. And again. And again. And again. And again. And again. And again. Well, that about wraps her up. Those final two films were very difficult to rank, but in the end I just had to go with my gut. Anyway, it's been an honour sharing my takes with you. Hope you didn't get too mad at my Magnolia placement. I don't have anything to sponsor in this video, but as you've made it to the end, consider subscribing to the channel, as more of these videos will be coming soon. And also make sure to put your own PTA ranking in the comment section. But until next time, have a good one.